I still remember the first Saturday morning after I moved into the old farmhouse. The quiet was exactly what I had paid for. Birds filled the trees with their songs. The breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass, and the only sounds were the distant hum of lawnmowers from the neighborhood beyond the tree line. My property bordered an upscale subdivision managed by an HOA, but a thick row of oak trees and an old split-rail fence clearly marked where my land began. I had surveyed the property before buying it, and every boundary marker was documented. That peaceful morning lasted less than an hour before I heard children's laughter echoing through the woods. Curious, I walked toward the fence, expecting to see kids playing in their own community park. Instead, I stopped in disbelief. Bright plastic slides, shiny swings, climbing bars, and even a picnic shelter had been built several yards inside my property. Families were already using it as if it had always belonged there. Parents smiled while children ran across grass that I had paid for only weeks earlier. For a moment, I wondered if I had somehow misunderstood the survey. Then I spotted one of my orange property stakes sticking out beside the sandbox. Someone had simply built around it. I calmly approached a woman wearing sunglasses who appeared to be organizing the event. She introduced herself as the HOA president before I even asked. With complete confidence, she welcomed me to our new neighborhood playground and thanked me for stopping by. When I explained that the playground was actually sitting on my land, her smile disappeared for only a second before returning with a laugh. She insisted the previous owner had always allowed community use and claimed the HOA had invested nearly $80,000 into the project. I politely told her that permission from a former owner, even if it existed, didn't transfer automatically after the property was sold. I asked who had authorized construction after my purchase. She shrugged and said the contractors were told everything had already been approved. Then she suggested I should simply enjoy having happy children nearby instead of worrying about property lines. That casual response told me everything I needed to know. They hadn't made a mistake. They had assumed I wouldn't challenge them. Instead of arguing in front of dozens of families, I walked back to my house and gathered every document from my closing file. The survey, deed, county GIS maps, and recorded boundary descriptions all matched perfectly. The playground was over 30 feet inside my property. I contacted the county planning office first thing Monday morning, expecting they might already know about the construction. They didn't. According to their records, no permits had been issued for a playground at that location. An inspector agreed to visit later that week. While waiting, I installed several temporary private property, no trespassing signs along the fence line. By sunset, every single sign had disappeared. The next morning they were gone completely, with fresh footprints leading back toward the subdivision. Someone didn't just ignore my warning, they removed the evidence that it had ever been there. That was the moment I realized this wasn't going to end with a polite conversation. When the county inspector arrived, he walked the property with professional precision, comparing GPS coordinates against the official survey. He looked at the playground, then at me, then back at the boundary markers that were still firmly in place. His conclusion was immediate. The structure had been built entirely on private property without permits or the owner's authorization. He photographed everything and promised to file a report. Before leaving, he quietly mentioned that the HOA could face serious legal consequences if they continued allowing public use after being formally notified. Armed with that report, I sent the HOA a certified letter demanding that the playground be removed within 30 days. I also warned that anyone entering my property without permission would be considered trespassing. Their response arrived less than a week later. It wasn't an apology. It was a letter from the HOA's attorney claiming the playground benefited the community, insisting I was being unreasonable, and suggesting that forcing its removal could expose me to public relations consequences. They even hinted that I should donate the land to the neighborhood as a gesture of goodwill. I read that letter twice before setting it on my kitchen table. Then I looked out the window and watched another group of parents pushing strollers across my field as though they owned every inch of it. Children laughed while adults chatted comfortably on benches that had been bolted into my soil without my permission. They believed I would eventually give up because fighting an HOA sounded expensive and exhausting. What they didn't realize was that I had no intention of arguing with them forever. If they wanted to pretend the playground belonged to the neighborhood, I was about to remind everyone exactly who owned the land beneath every swing, slide, and picnic table. My next move wouldn't involve another letter or another meeting. It would involve something far simpler, completely legal, and impossible for them to ignore. The morning after I finished reading the HOA's letter, I stopped wasting time trying to convince people who had already decided the rules didn't apply to them. Instead, I called a local fencing contractor and asked one simple question. Can you build a secure gate around private property in less than a week? He laughed and said it depended on the budget. I told him speed mattered more than cost. 2 days later, trucks rolled onto my land carrying heavy steel fencing, concrete posts, and a pair of commercial-grade locking gates. Everything was installed several feet inside my legal property line, exactly where the survey markers indicated. Every permit was approved, every measurement was documented, and every step was photographed. I wasn't blocking a public park. I was securing my own property. By Friday afternoon, the playground was completely enclosed behind an 8-foot fence with large signs that read, "Private property. No trespassing. Entry by owner's permission only." The reaction came almost instantly. Saturday morning looked nothing like the peaceful weekends the neighborhood had grown used to. Families arrived with folding chairs, coolers, and excited children, only to find locked gates standing between them and the playground. Parents stared at the signs in disbelief. Some tugged on the gate as if it might magically open. Others pulled out their phones, taking pictures while children asked why they couldn't go inside. Within minutes, I saw the HOA president marching across the grass toward my house, followed by 2 board members wearing expressions that made it clear they expected me to back down. She knocked hard enough to rattle the front door before demanding that I remove the fence immediately. According to her, I was holding community property hostage. I calmly invited her to point out which document proved the playground belonged to the community instead of me. She couldn't. Instead, she repeated that the HOA had paid for everything and that the neighborhood deserved access because everyone had already become accustomed to using it. I reminded her that paying to build something on someone else's land without permission didn't transfer ownership. If anything, it made the mistake more expensive. She accused me of being selfish and claimed I was punishing innocent children. I answered as politely as I could. I didn't build a playground on someone else's property. Your board did. She didn't appreciate that response. Before leaving, she warned me that the HOA would take every legal step necessary to reopen the park. I simply wished her good luck and closed the door. Less than an hour later, I received an email from their attorney demanding that I unlock the gates immediately while the ownership dispute was being resolved. The funny part was there wasn't actually a dispute. Every official document already confirmed the land belonged to me. They were simply hoping pressure would accomplish what the law could not. A few days later, something happened that completely changed the situation. One of my security cameras recorded a pickup truck arriving just after midnight. 3 men climbed out carrying bolt cutters and work gloves. They walked directly to the front gate, clearly believing nobody was watching. The first man tried cutting the chain, but the heavy-duty lock barely showed a scratch. Frustrated, another climbed over the fence, while the third attempted to force the gate open from the inside. Before they could do any real damage, motion-activated floodlights illuminated the entire area like a football stadium. Every camera captured their faces in crystal-clear detail. They panicked, jumped back over the fence, and sped away within seconds. I immediately copied the footage and delivered it to the sheriff's office the next morning. The deputy recognized one of the men almost immediately. He wasn't a random vandal. He was the HOA's maintenance supervisor. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected. The maintenance supervisor admitted he had been instructed to restore public access, but refused to say exactly who gave the order. That answer wasn't enough for investigators, especially after they discovered text messages discussing how to remove the locks before the next community event. Suddenly, the issue wasn't just about trespassing anymore. It involved attempted property damage and possible conspiracy. Word spread through the subdivision almost overnight. Many homeowners who had originally supported the board began asking uncomfortable questions. Why had the HOA spent tens of thousands of dollars without confirming ownership? Why were board members sending employees onto private property after receiving formal legal notices? More importantly, why had residents been told the land belonged to the neighborhood when county records clearly showed otherwise? Within days, my mailbox filled with anonymous letters from frustrated homeowners. Some apologized for believing the HOA's version of events. Others included copies of meeting minutes, internal emails, and budget reports that painted an even uglier picture. According to those documents, several board members had known the land wasn't owned by the association before construction even started. One email stood out above all the others. It read, "He'll probably never notice. If he does, we'll deal with it later." I stared at that sentence for a long time. It confirmed exactly what I had suspected from the beginning. This had never been an innocent misunderstanding. It had been a calculated gamble. They assumed the new owner would stay quiet, and when that failed, they tried intimidation instead. They still believed they could outlast me. What they didn't know was that those leaked documents were about to become the strongest evidence in a lawsuit that would put the entire HOA board under a microscope. The anonymous documents completely changed the direction of the case. Instead of simply proving that the playground had been built on my property, they revealed how the decision had been made in the first place. My attorney carefully organized every email, meeting note, and budget record into a timeline. The more we read, the worse it became for the HOA board. Months before construction had started, one board member had questioned whether the association actually owned the parcel of land. Rather than ordering a title search or requesting a professional survey, the HOA president dismissed the concern by saying that nobody would ever challenge it. Another email showed they had intentionally delayed checking county records because doing so might slow down the project. They weren't confused. They had simply chosen convenience over legality, assuming that if the playground was finished quickly enough, removing it later would become too expensive for anyone to demand. As discovery continued, contractors who had worked on the project were interviewed under oath. One construction supervisor admitted that he had asked where the property lines were before breaking ground. According to his testimony, an HOA representative pointed toward the tree line and confidently said, "Everything on this side belongs to the association." The contractor relied on that statement and continued working without requesting additional documentation. Another subcontractor remembered seeing orange survey stakes but was instructed to remove them because they were in the way of the equipment. Hearing that made my attorney smile for the first time in weeks. Those missing stakes weren't destroyed by accident. Someone had deliberately removed official boundary markers while construction was underway. That single detail strengthened our case far beyond simple trespassing. It suggested intentional interference with clearly identified property boundaries. The courtroom was packed on the morning of the first hearing. Residents filled nearly every seat, eager to watch the dispute that had divided the neighborhood for months. The HOA president arrived surrounded by attorneys, looking as confident as ever. That confidence faded quickly once the judge began reviewing the evidence. My survey, county records, permit reports, inspection photographs, security footage, and internal HOA emails all told the same story. When the judge asked whether the association possessed any deed, easement, lease, or written agreement granting them permission to build on my land, the courtroom became painfully quiet. Their attorney admitted they had none. Instead, he argued that the community had relied on the playground for months, and that removing it would create unnecessary hardship for local families. The judge looked directly at him and replied that inconvenience could not erase private property rights. Those words shifted the atmosphere instantly. The HOA's legal team made one final attempt to save the project by offering to purchase the portion of land containing the playground. Their first offer was so low that it wouldn't have covered half the market value. My attorney politely rejected it without making a counteroffer. A second proposal arrived later that afternoon with a higher price and promises to cover legal expenses. I declined again. By that point, the issue had never been about money. If they had approached me honestly before construction began, we might have negotiated a lease or a sale. Instead, they built first, ignored repeated warnings, removed my signs, attempted to cut my locks, and then tried to pressure me into surrendering the property. Rewarding that behavior would only encourage it to happen again, whether to me or someone else. The judge agreed to schedule a final hearing, but before leaving the courtroom, he strongly suggested both sides prepare for the likelihood that the playground would have to be removed entirely. News of the hearing spread throughout the county within days. Local newspapers ran headlines about the HOA's failed land grab, and television reporters interviewed homeowners outside the subdivision entrance. Many residents who had defended the board now openly criticized its leadership. Attendance at HOA meetings doubled almost overnight. Financial records were questioned. Spending decisions were challenged. Several homeowners demanded the resignation of every board member involved in approving the project. What had started as a dispute over a playground was rapidly becoming a crisis of confidence inside the entire association. Even families who were disappointed about losing the play area admitted they were far more upset about being misled for nearly a year. They realized their dues had funded construction on land the HOA never owned, followed by legal fees that continued climbing every week. A few evenings after the hearing, I stood near the locked gate watching the sun set behind the empty playground. The swings moved gently in the breeze, untouched since the fence had gone up. It was strangely peaceful. For the first time in months, there were no angry emails, no shouting across the fence, and no unexpected visitors pounding on my front door. My attorney called just before sunset with one final update. During settlement discussions, another former board member had agreed to testify against the HOA leadership in exchange for immunity from personal liability. According to him, there were conversations that had never appeared in the official meeting minutes. Conversations that could prove the board knowingly approved construction on private land despite repeated warnings. If his testimony matched the documents we already had, the final hearing wasn't just going to decide the fate of the playground. It could determine whether several HOA officials would be held personally responsible for every dollar the association had wasted. The final hearing arrived nearly a year after I first discovered children playing on a playground that should never have existed. By then, the story had spread far beyond our county. Reporters lined the courthouse steps before sunrise, and residents filled every available seat inside the courtroom. Some came hoping the HOA would somehow save the playground. Others wanted answers about how their dues had been spent without proper oversight. I wasn't interested in the attention. I simply wanted the court to confirm what had been obvious from the beginning, that private property still meant something, regardless of how many people wished it were otherwise. My attorney organized our evidence one last time while the HOA's legal team quietly shuffled stacks of paperwork that looked far less convincing than they had only a few months earlier. The turning point came when the former HOA board member took the witness stand. Under oath, he described meetings that had never appeared in the official minutes. He testified that several directors had warned the president the association did not own the land. According to him, one member even recommended hiring a surveyor before approving construction. That recommendation was rejected because it might delay the grand opening and increase costs. He also confirmed that the board expected the new owner, me, to eventually accept the situation rather than spend time and money fighting it. Then came the statement that changed everything. He testified that after receiving my certified demand letter, the board discussed making it politically impossible for me to enforce my rights by portraying me as the neighbor who wanted to take a playground away from children. The courtroom became silent. The judge looked directly at the HOA president and asked whether she wished to dispute that testimony. After a long pause, her attorney declined to ask any follow-up questions. The judge's decision was detailed and left little room for interpretation. He ruled that the HOA had knowingly built permanent structures on privately owned land without authorization, failed to verify ownership before construction, ignored multiple opportunities to correct the mistake, and continued encouraging public access after receiving formal notice that the property belonged to someone else. The court ordered the HOA to remove every piece of playground equipment, every concrete foundation, every picnic table, and every fence section they had installed. They were required to restore my property to its original condition under the supervision of the county. The association was also ordered to reimburse my legal fees, replace damaged landscaping, compensate me for unauthorized use of the property, and pay additional penalties related to the removal of survey markers and repeated trespassing. The total financial impact reached well into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, far more than the cost of simply asking for permission before building. The following weeks were unlike anything I had expected. Heavy equipment returned to the property, but this time it wasn't there to build. It was there to dismantle everything piece by piece. Children watched from outside the fence as workers carefully removed the slides, swings, climbing structures, and picnic shelter. I genuinely felt sorry for the families who had enjoyed the playground. None of this had been their fault. Several parents even walked over to apologize, admitting they had believed the HOA's claim that the land belonged to the community. I told them I never blamed the residents. My disagreement had always been with the people who knowingly ignored the law and expected everyone else to live with the consequences. As the last truck pulled away carrying the final section of playground equipment, the open field looked almost exactly as it had on the day I bought the property. The only reminder of the dispute was a few patches of fresh soil waiting for new grass to grow. The consequences inside the neighborhood were just as dramatic. Homeowners voted to remove nearly the entire HOA board during the next election. Independent auditors were hired to examine years of financial records, uncovering several questionable spending decisions unrelated to the playground project. Insurance premiums increased after the lawsuit, and special assessments were required to cover expenses that insurance refused to pay because of the board's intentional conduct. Many residents were frustrated, but most agreed that accountability was long overdue. The new leadership introduced strict policies requiring professional surveys, legal review, and homeowner transparency before any future construction project could be approved. Ironically, the costly mistake ended up protecting the neighborhood from similar problems for years to come. Today, that section of my property looks very different. Instead of swings and climbing bars, there's a wide meadow filled with native wildflowers and young oak trees. Deer often cross the field in the early morning, and birds have returned to areas that were once covered by concrete and playground equipment. Every now and then, someone driving through the neighborhood slows down to look toward the old playground site, probably remembering everything that happened there. I don't feel any satisfaction from winning a legal battle. What matters is that the outcome reinforced a simple principle that should never have been questioned in the first place. Respecting property rights isn't optional just because a project seems beneficial or popular. If the HOA had knocked on my door before breaking ground, we might have found a solution that worked for everyone. Instead, they chose entitlement over honesty, and that decision cost them far more than a playground. It cost them their credibility, their leadership, and a fortune that could have been avoided with one simple act of respect.